Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, January 2nd, 2023. And first of all, Happy New Year to you. Hope you had a very happy and safe Christmas and holiday season. I'm actually glad to be back at it after taking some time off, which I definitely enjoyed. But on this episode, I'm talking about the latest open letter from the ATF. This time, the so-called frame or receiver rule. They sent out an open letter to all FFLs last week, Tuesday. Basically, what we have here is an unconstitutional agency that shouldn't exist in the first place. They did exactly what the founders warned us would happen if you give them power to define the limits of their own power. They're going to keep finding new creative ways to change definitions of words and expand their own power all the time. It just happens. But there are already 3 states that are taking action to nullify this new rule in practice and effect. We've got Arizona, Missouri, and Montana. I'm going to cover all that and more in just a moment. But first of all, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, the mainstream platforms are a little bit slow to send these out. And I actually forgot to set up the Rumble live stream. We did our first one over on Rumble just at the end of the year last year, and I'm going to start doing that more consistently soon as well. Anyways, hi to everyone out in the live chat. There's Liberty Revolutionary. Good to see you, Tim Martin, Dixie Strong, Ray Armendariz. I apologize if I got the name wrong. Lawrence Smith, Alan Hughes, Jonathan Shellman, Richard Banks, Haji. Good to see you, buddy, in Southeast Michigan. Ragnar, that Liberty gal. I'm going to be good morning from Dallas-Fort Worth. Good to see you as well. Melissa Mayer, Alan Hughes, Larry Clark, Christine, and everyone else. I know I'm missing a few people. Thank you for being here. If I get a chance to answer some comments or questions a little bit later in the show, I will absolutely do that. Otherwise, please keep leaving comments. I read through them throughout the week. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes from your feedback, whether it's in support or you think I've said something dumb or whatever. Let's start out with some foundational principles here. If we're talking about the ATF, and I keep talking about how the ATF shouldn't exist and all federal gun control shouldn't exist, all this stuff, let's talk about some foundational principles from the founding generation, the old revolutionaries. And I think Mercy Otis Warren really sums this up best. She said, self-defense is a primary law of nature. To the founders of the old revolutionaries, rights are not gifts from government. They don't exist because they are written down on paper. They don't come from constitutions. We don't have a Second Amendment right. You just have rights. Self-defense, she said, is a primary law of nature which no subsequent law of society can abolish. Or James Wilson, one of the preeminent legal minds of the time. He served on the Supreme Court. He was a leading Federalist supporter of the Constitution. He said the defense of one's self, justly called the primary law of nature. Now, Mercy said it was a primary law. James Wilson thought it was the primary law of nature, the defense of oneself. He said it is not, nor can it be abrogated by any regulation of municipal law. But we have to remember that constitutions don't enforce themselves. Natural rights don't enforce themselves. They never did, and they never will. And John Dickinson told us, he's the penman of the American Revolution, this is in his 4th Fabius letter, that defending the Constitution and protecting our own liberty would be up to the supreme sovereignty of the people. He said it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. And that brings me to what I want to get to today, the latest from the ATF, an unconstitutional agency that every action it does shouldn't exist. But here from, the New York Times on Tuesday, this is the 27th, I believe, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which should be a store, I guess, directed vendors who sell partially finished frames of Glock-style handguns, the pistol grip and firing mechanism, to treat them like fully completed firearms, which are subject to federal regulation. So parts of firearms are now to be treated as fully completed firearms. And the reason it gets that way is because people have allowed the government to regulate certain things. And of course, they're going to expand that power over time and expand how they define things. So we shouldn't be surprised this is happening, but we should be pretty pissed off. The move, they said, outlined in an open letter to federally licensed gun dealers. Man, that in and of itself, the idea of gun dealer, someone selling things, having to get a license from the federal government is also absurd. It's also absurd when it comes to the Constitution. It requires sellers to mark the parts with serial numbers and for buyers to undergo criminal background checks. The guidance could severely restrict the sale of unregulated, untraceable 80% frames and receivers. They want to make it sound scary and nasty. They call it ghost guns because, of course, people are supposed to be afraid of ghosts. Here from the ATF itself, they said, and this is from, and I will link to all this stuff, all the things that I'm going to be citing in this episode, you'll be able to find. I publish a blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. I publish a blog post for every episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. And in there, you're going to find not just all the different platforms we're on. We're on the mainstream video ones where we live stream like Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and sometimes Rumble and then Odyssey as well. But we also archive our video and audio-only podcast editions everywhere. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podbean. We're on Gab TV and Minds and elsewhere. Anyways, I will link to this ATF press release open letter thing in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. And here's how the ATF puts it. In April 2022, the Department of Justice announced a new frame or receiver rule which modernizes the definition of a firearm. They basically take a word, they find a way that they want to control what they want to do, and then they just change the definition of the word to expand it to fit the stuff that they want to do. Again, we shouldn't be surprised that this happens. I'll get back to John Dickinson on that in a moment. Partially complete, they said, Polymer 80, Lone Wolf, and similar striker-fired semi-automatic pistol frames, including but not limited to those sold within parts kits, are regulated by the Gun Control Act of 1968, another federal act that shouldn't exist, because they have reached a stage of manufacture where they may, quote, be readily completed, assembled, restored, or otherwise converted to a functional frame. Here, if you really, really want to read the whole ATF rule, here it is. I've got a link to it in the Federal Register, federalregister.gov. This is the summary. The Department of Justice is, and there's some key things here to really just pay attention to, not really on on how they do this type of thing. The Department of Justice is amending the ATF regulations to remove and replace the regulatory definitions of firearm framer receiver and framer receiver because the current regulations fail to capture the full meaning of those terms. So they want to be able to capture and control and regulate and ban and restrict liberty on more items, on more people, and the current law that shouldn't have existed in the first place doesn't do everything that they want to do. Anyways, they go on further. The department is also amending ATF's definition of firearm and gunsmith. So just change the word to fit how you want it to fit, to give you the power that you want to have. To clarify the meaning of those terms and to provide definitions of those. No, ATF didn't say that, but that's my ad. To clarify the meaning of those terms and to provide definitions of terms such as complete weapon, complete muffler or silencer device, multi-piece frame or receiver, privately made firearm, and readily, for purposes of clarity, given it advancements in firearms technology. Now, let's say they were authorized to have the Gun Control Act, and they were authorized to do this to change definitions. It would still take an act of Congress, not a regulatory agency just doing whatever the hell they want, whenever they want. I think the Liberty Doll summed it up perfectly over on Twitter and her YouTube video on this just late last week. Gun parts are now firearms. And this is exactly what people with power will always do. I mentioned I would reference John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution. I believe this was from his, maybe the seventh of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, where he railed against the Townshend Acts. And he said, all artful rulers, which is kind of redundant, all artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits endeavor to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. In other words, they're going to come up with creative ways to claim that the stuff that they want to do is legal and authorized, constitutional. And that's just what we see here in the Federal Register. Oh, well, what we're doing is we're just updating things to fit technological advancements. And as long as the people are okay with government telling the people what their constitution means, what the limits of power that government agencies are going to have, or if they can even exist, then government is going to keep expanding, no matter which team is in power. Now, ultimately, it's far more important. If you want to read through that Federal Register, I will link to it. If you want to read through that and get all the details of what they're going after and their approach, or maybe check out the video that Liberty Doll posted as well over on YouTube, I will link to that as well. But I think ultimately it's far more important to understand what to do about it. Do we go to the federal government in the hopes that the federal government will somehow magically limit its own power? I don't think so. Here's how Mike Meharry put it in an article sometime last year. He said, states can nullify these federal rules in practice and effect simply by refusing to participate in their enforcement and implementation. This is for states, localities, and most importantly, for individuals. Mike goes on, he said, the federal government relies heavily on state cooperation to implement and enforce almost all its so-called laws, regulations, acts, mandates, etc., including federal gun control. As noted by the National Governors Association, Mike writes, during the partial government shutdown of 2013, now they always call these things shutdown because, of course, they want to use scare terms like ghost gun, for example, shutdown. Oh, everything's going to break down in the world, but the empire doesn't really stop. They don't stop spying. They don't stop stealing stuff from people. They'll just shut down some parks and try to make things inconvenient for people and then demand more money. But anyways, during the 2013 shutdown, the National Governors Association sent out one of these kind of open letters. They were very concerned about what was going on. Why? Because they said, quote, states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And here's the dirty little secret they don't want you to know. Partnerships don't work when half the team quits. Here from the ATF, this is their most recent facts and figures fact sheet for, this was fiscal year 2021. We'll get the 22 one in the next 3 to 12 months sometime. We can see that the ATF, and I know they've just tried to expand it, maybe they actually did, but not by a huge amount. They have total employees of 5,093 employees that really need to get an actual job rather than doing what they're doing, but they're there. 5,093 full-time employees total. They have 2,700 special agents and another 800 or so industry operations investigators. So it's like 3,400 to 3,600 basically special agents and investigators, enforcement agents. And with this workforce size, the ATF is able to close somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 cases per year on anything. 8 and 10,000 is 8 to 10,000 too many. But think of it this way. If there were 10 or 11 or maybe 13 million of these so-called now illegal unserialized firearm parts, there's absolutely no way that the feds could do really much anything about it. It would just be a small dent in the total number. And of course, we don't want those 8 to 10,000 people, those 8 to 10,000 cases, we don't want them thrown in cages for exercising their natural right of self-defense, the primary or a primary law of nature. But really, they don't have the power to stop this. And over time, this can break the whole thing down. And that's exactly what the founders told us over and over and over and over. Just a couple of examples. Here's Roger Sherman in December 8th, 1787, I believe, was the letter. All acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. And that includes acts of Congress that claim to give an agency a power to make their own law and change laws or rules on a whim. Nor, Roger Sherman said, could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. And states, in this context, he's not just talking about state governments, he's also talking about the people of the state. So when the people of the states especially a majority of them, all act in unison in opposition to how a federal act is, they can't enforce it. That's what Roger Sherman had to say, and that's what James Madison advised as well. In Federalist number 46, he advised a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, not just by individuals, but by states, a combination. He said if a single state would do this is in Federalist 46, it would make it very difficult for the federal government to be able to enforce anything and in that particular state. But if a number of adjoining states had the same view, Madison told us, it would make these federal acts nearly impossible to enforce. He said it would create an environment the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. And that's exactly what we see playing out right now regarding this particular regulation, this particular rule. In 2021, we had 3 states, Arizona, Missouri, and Montana, that all passed laws of varying degree helping to protect and preserve the Second Amendment and your natural right to keep and bear arms by banning them from participation in the enforcement of various federal gun control measures, specifically for this conversation, this new ATF rule. I'll link to reports on them in the show notes so you can learn more. Here's, for example, first of all, from TJ Martinell, talking about the Montana law, which was HB 258. He wanted to cover how a federal raid actually happens. He said the standard practice for federal raids is to coordinate in advance with local police to perform a variety of duties, such as creating a perimeter around the scene, stringing tape, and monitoring. So if state and local law enforcement agencies in Montana, in Arizona, and Missouri are banned from helping the ATF enforce this, if the ATF wants to enforce these rules, they're not going to get this type of support. Going further, also, if someone is arrested, they are typically housed in a local police jail, a detail that is predetermined to the raid. If the planned raid is conducted specifically for violating the new ATF rules, state and local police can't assist at all. This is Montana, Arizona, and Missouri. If it occurs anyway, and the person is arrested on charge of violating those ATF rules, the feds still must find their own place to house suspects. I mean, there aren't, at least from what I know of, any federal jails for this in Montana. The locals won't house them. So what's the ATF going to do? Are they going to rent out a floor in a local motel and then have armed guards on it 24/7 for up to maybe 3 weeks while they try to work out an extradition process? Because that's basically how it'll have to go to Idaho. And what if Idaho says no? Well, they're going to go to Washington. They'll go to Washington State before Idaho, I'm sure. But this is the same kind of approach, the same strategic approach that basically every single northern state did throughout the 1830s to 1850s in response to the hated Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I covered that in an episode that I will link to in the show notes. It's important for historical understanding of nullification. It's also important to understand what they did because it works so well, and we can apply that strategy on basically anything and everything today. The Michigan Personal Freedom Act, for example, of 1855, it banned federal slave catchers from using state or local jails. So when they wanted to catch a slave and they wanted to throw him in jail, or an escaped runaway slave, man, it's so horrible to even think about this. But when they would do that, they wanted to rely on the states to help them, and then the states refused to do so, and so they weren't able to pull it off. And they were extremely effective in using James Madison's approach, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. It proved that the father of the Constitution knew what he was talking about when he said what it was going to be required, what it was going to take to keep the federal government in check. Again, I will link to that episode in the show notes. It's an interesting side point. Here from TJ Martinell's article again. Here's Gary Marbut from the Montana Shooting Sports Association, who did such great work to get House Bill 258 passed in Montana. He said the feds will, this is a quote from Marbut, the feds will figure that out pretty quickly. To do a law enforcement action that doesn't involve locals, they're going to have to put together a whole different plan of action with anybody they take into custody. They don't like that. It's grunt work. They're not used to it. it's going to be a bother. And even when you get down to the raid end of it, we were talking about how a raid plays out. They're going to run the perimeter. Maybe there's going to be a chopper flying overhead, conducting surveillance. They have to cut off traffic, redirect it. That's all done by the locals. And then even if you're talking about an actual serving a warrant, maybe you have one local ATF agent, one federal agent in the local office. Maybe two of them will be on scene. And if you see this whole kind of pattern where you've got basically a V of armed police ready to go in and bust the door down, those are always local sheriff, local PD, and they will also be banned from participating in all this stuff. So the feds rely on states to be partners, and partnerships don't work when half the team quits. I did a whole episode specifically on Montana regarding these so-called these new ATF rules and regulations, Montana versus the ATF. And I will link to that in the show notes. But I don't want to just focus on Montana. If we're talking about dealing with federal gun control, Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act is the strongest by far of anything that's been passed in any state in the country. This went into effect in June of 2021. And here from a report by Mike Meharry, what a surprise, Mike does such great work. The new law bans any entity or person, including any public officer or employee of the state of Missouri and its political subdivisions, so states and localities, from enforcing any past, present, or future. So really smart into not just addressing stuff that's on the books, but also stuff in the future. Montana's only addressed stuff in the future. So that was narrow, but we see how federal power always seeks to expand, so all of a sudden it starts catching these new things. But the Missouri Act from Representative Jared Taylor bans them from participating in the enforcement of any federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, regulations, statutes, or ordinances that infringe on the right to keep and bear arms. I will link to a detailed overview of that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And of course, we have Arizona, which is a very, very straightforward, very simple bill. And it also bans the state and political subdivisions of the state from, quote, using any personnel or financial resources to enforce, administer, or cooperate with any act, law, treaty, order, rule, or regulation of the United States government that is inconsistent with any law of the state of Arizona regarding the regulation of firearms. Now, this does not end all gun control in each of these states, but it is a powerful and very strategic first step that James Madison, Roger Sherman advised that they used in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. It worked, basically saying, we're not going to help you do this stuff, and recognizing that they don't have the resources to do it all on their own. So the short version, the TLDR, for these three states, if it's a federal gun control measure, depending on the state, various levels of how detailed this gets, the state will not exist. The state will not assist in enforcement. And I don't generally link to these guys, but everytownresearch.org has a very handy page to let us know which states also regulate these so-called, we'll call them ghost guns, these part kits requiring serialization of firearm parts. Of course, you've got places like here in California and Hawaii, Washington State, New York, etc. But none of these, and the only one in the center of the country that does this as well is Illinois. So if all these other states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Arkansas, Louisiana, they should all be passing laws that ban them from helping in the enforcement, because that would automatically create an environment for the people to nullify this stuff in practice and effect. Now, I know the usual approach for most people, especially in the right to keep and bear arms, the mainstream right to keep and bear arms, pro-Second Amendment community, is to wait for it to play out in court. We're going to take them to court, we're going to sue them, and then the feds are going to do the right thing, and then we're going to have freedom. And here, back to the New York Times, they point out this is probably going to happen on this one. Administration officials said the new guidance would almost certainly be challenged in federal court on the grounds that it violates the Gun Control Act of 1968. On the grounds that it violates a federal act that shouldn't exist in the first place is how I see it. Because the Gun Control Act of 1968 allows people to build firearms for their personal use without submitting to background checks or applying serial numbers. So this is pretty nuts. So you're going to sue the feds in federal court, basically validate by having a lawsuit saying that this violates the Gun Control Act. The lawsuit in and of itself is helping validate, further entrench the Gun Control Act of 68 into existence. So I'm not really on board with that. But even more importantly, waiting on one branch of the federal government to tell you that another branch of the federal government is violating the Constitution and to allow you to be free. This is not a state of liberty. This is a population on its knees begging for permission. Thomas Jefferson had a little something to say about things like this, and he put it this way: a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. So a free people doesn't wait for the government to tell them that the government did something that the government wasn't supposed to do in the first place. A free people learns how to exercise their rights, whether the government wants them to or not. And think of this in conjunction with these three states that I'm highlighting today: Missouri, Montana, and Arizona. Now, this is great that these states are saying, at least in some ways, and sometimes it's very narrow, sometimes it's broad, that they're not going to help the federal government violate your natural rights in this particular area. That's very positive. But ultimately, if the people are compliant with the federal government, it doesn't matter what states ban enforcement or help to the ATF, because if there's no enforcement actions required because everyone's complying, there's no nullification that's going to happen by the state action. And I think Lysander Spooner gives us some great insight, again, back to the time of the Fugitive Slave Act. He wrote a great paper called A Defense for Fugitive Slaves. This is a little bit of a long piece that I wanted to read to you. This is from 1850, but he said it this way: it is no answer to this argument to say that if an unconstitutional act be passed, the mischief can be remedied by a repeal of it, and that this remedy may be brought about by discussion and the exercise of the right of suffrage. So Spooner's saying, look, if they pass an unconstitutional act, a lot of people will tell you, hey, and he talks about going to the courts and things like that, but okay, wait to get some new bums in office and get that changed, or wait for the courts to overturn that and then it'll be gone. So in other words, wait for the unconstitutional act to be changed by the organization that gave it to us in the first place. He continues, he said, because if an unconstitutional act be binding until invalidated by repeal, the government may, in the meantime, disarm the people, suppress the freedom of speech in the press, prohibit the use of the suffrage, and thus put it beyond the power of the people to reform the government through the exercise of those rights. In other words, if you allow the government to be the ones to say that the government made a mistake, you're going to run into a lot of problems, and it looks like Spooner pretty much called it. And really, it gets down to the people, again, doing what Jefferson told us. A free people exercises their rights as derived from the laws of nature, no matter what the government has to say about it. And that's what Spooner summed up here. He said, to say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one, for the latter is binding only until it is repealed. So if you believe that an unconstitutional act has been passed, then it is up to you to work with other people to find ways to actually, get past that without waiting for the government. There would, Spooner said, therefore, be no difference at all between a constitutional and an unconstitutional law in respect to their binding force, and that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving the government unlimited power. Again, ultimately, it is up to the people, as John Dickinson told us, to protect and preserve the Constitution and their own liberty. It is up to the people to learn how to exercise their rights, all, as Jefferson said as well, whether the government wants us to or not. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. This is really essential stuff that we try to get out to people more and more every day, whether it's on the ATF or on all kinds of other federal acts and agencies that shouldn't exist. And there's absolutely nothing on earth that helps us do this work every day more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a little extra of that dirty government fiat laying around and you want to throw it some way, throw it our way. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. You can find that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do want to take a quick moment and say a huge thank you and a quick hello to just a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. There's Kristen in Ohio, Dave in Washington State, Terry in Alabama, Charles in Tennessee, John in Illinois, Justin in Florida, Kathy in Pennsylvania, and also Chad in Pennsylvania. I really appreciate you guys putting your financial faith behind the 10th Amendment Center. And again, if you haven't joined yet and you want to take a look at that, we also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, that's all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I will take a look over at the live chat a little bit later today and probably a little bit tomorrow as well. I see a bunch of back and forth here, heavily on YouTube and Facebook, but I really appreciate your feedback here today. Of course, you can here's a good one. You cannot comply your way yourself out of tyranny. That's Bonehead88 over on YouTube. And that's really the message that we're putting out there from Dickinson, Jefferson, Spooner, and a bunch of others in between. And no matter what these states do to do nullification actions, and we're seeing more and more than we ever have, we're going to have our latest edition of the State of the Nullification Movement Report published sometime, I hope this week, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. We're seeing more actions by the states, but ultimately it gets down to what Samuel Adams said. All might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So really, it ultimately is up to the people loving liberty, valuing liberty, and doing what's necessary to have their rights, no matter what the empire happens to say. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope this was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. Again, Happy New Year to you. Check out the blog post that'll be up on this in the next couple of hours over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I look forward to seeing you next time here, on the Path to Liberty. Have a great day.